Joining us now on the program is the democracy correspondent for The Guardian, Sam Levine. Welcome to the show.
Hey, John, thanks so much for having me.
Glad to have you on, although possibly by the very nature of your beat on The Guardian, it's generally not happy news. You write about a lot of different topics, but what I want to focus on today with you is your recent work profiling the passage of reproductive rights focused legislation that seems out of step at the state level with the stated desires of the populace of those states. And I know that you focused recently on, I believe it was Ohio, and what happened politically after they passed a bill like this. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found?
Well, Ohio is sort of this perfect case study of how politicians continue to pass extreme anti-abortion measures, even though they're widely out of step with what the public believes. A majority of people in Ohio and vast majority of people across the United States continue to believe that abortion should be legal in at least some, if not all, circumstances. And yet what we've seen in Ohio and elsewhere is state legislatures continue to pass more and more extreme restrictions on abortion. So I went into my reporting recently thinking, how is this the case, and how do these politicians who pass these measures face very little accountability at the polls? And I think a big part of that story has to do with the gerrymandering. Politicians in Ohio and elsewhere have been able to draw districts that virtually guarantee their party's majorities in the legislature, no matter what happens at the polls. So even though they're passing policies that are extremely unpopular, they continue to be reelected. And Ohio is sort of a perfect case study of how this has happened. In 2010, Republicans flipped the Ohio legislature. They controlled the redistricting process. They drew districts that locked in their majority for the next decade. And very soon after that, we started to see a very clear parade of anti-abortion measures. Ohio Republicans, even as they've continued to pass that, have not lost seats in the Ohio legislature. They've expanded their majorities. So gerrymandering has acted as sort of this invisible shield that has insulated lawmakers there from any sort of accountability when it comes to voters.
So that certainly seems like a very plausible explanation for it. I'm curious about whether you looked into any other influences. So for instance, is it possible that people have a different position on this issue than their elected representatives, but perhaps aren't prioritizing it? Is there anything in the polling that tries to get into how tightly tied people's position on this or some other issue is to their actual vote preference?
Yeah, to be clear, I don't think we could say that gerrymandering is totally to explains all of anti-abortion measures. But I think it's something that's not talked about enough as sort of this undergirding structure that allows politicians to pass these measures with little fear of being held accountable at the ballot box.
Have you done any research? Is there any reason to believe that? As I know the Democrats right now, some of what they seem to be saying internally is, it might be that, as you've described, in the state level, Republicans are able to get away with passing these sorts of laws. But if the Supreme Court does strike it down, there could be consequences in terms of the presidential vote, or maybe that would be significant enough to get past some of the structural obstacles that you're identifying. Is there any reason to believe that taking it away from the context of one particular state and eliminating wholesale the rights in many states, that might get through the process that you're describing?
Well, I'm not sure. I think what we've seen in recent years is that state legislatures have really become the engine for many of the most extreme and controversial measures. And what we've seen over the last decade or so is that Republicans have really cemented their grip on control of these state legislatures. So I think, regardless of, what the Supreme Court is able to do, state legislatures are going to continue to be the main engine through which we're going to see the most controversial abortion and many other bills.
Yeah, and you're focusing obviously on how gerrymandering and that sort of thing can influence this. We were talking before we went live with our interview about what it seems like the approach of some of the higher courts are going to be when it comes to questions of how far a party can go in manipulating the political outcomes in their state. And as you've described it, it seems like the Supreme Court is going to be pretty tolerant of some very radical gerrymandering.
Yeah, what we've seen from the Supreme Court and other appellate courts recently is a real reluctance to step in and police any kind of gerrymandering. The Supreme Court, of course, said in 2019 that there was nothing federal courts could do to police partisan gerrymandering. There's a separate issue that deals with racial discrimination in redistricting, which is still very much something that the federal courts police. But what we've seen this year is federal courts are even reluctant to police that. The Supreme Court in an Alabama case basically let a map go into effect that a lower court had found was racially discriminatory. And we were talking about that just this week. A court in Louisiana struck down that state's congressional map, saying it was also racially discriminatory. And I would imagine that the Supreme Court is going to be very reluctant to keep that map struck down. So there's a real deference that we're seeing from the courts to politicians to give them an extreme amount of power to draw maps that discriminate based on partisanship, and more alarmingly this year, that discriminate based on race.
Yeah, I have to say it might seem, and the way that we hear Democrats talk about these two different issues about the assaults against reproductive rights and some of the assaults that we're seeing against voting rights are relatively separate. And I have my own personal frustrations about the lack of the Democrats' seeming resolve to deal with either of those. But your work seems to imply that perhaps the response should be interconnected, that these things do actually influence each other. And so I appreciate your work going into that area. I know that you cover a lot of different topics having to do with democracy. And so anyone watching this, if this is something that you take seriously, and I advise that you should, Sam's work is available at The Guardian. And we appreciate you taking the time out to join us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Anytime.
For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.